adventure as someone watching over the shoulder. So that's been a real blessing. I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce Tim Aho, a mission person from Great Britain. Tim.
All right, good morning. And we have to say good morning online people as well these days too, don't we? It's a different world than it was 2 years ago, isn't it? Yeah. Well, Tammy and I are glad to be here and glad to be friends with Dick and Pat. And so we moved into Stafford in August of 1992.
Goodness.
So that's when we first met, was
Yes.
autumn of 1992 at
Right.
Chancellor Christian Church back in
That's
the day.
right.
So to stay focused on the topic about stewardship, and I appreciate the bit of introduction there that Dick gave about, did you call him Dr. Dick? Dr. Barnett, okay. So I'm going to call him Dick, okay? Thinking about that whole idea of stewardship, because probably the thing that we get asked about is, how did you decide that you're going to be involved in cross-cultural ministry in England? That's maybe something that comes to your mind as well. And stewardship is actually part of that response. So a little bit of background, just so you're aware a bit more of our history. So I'm originally from Minnesota. I grew up in Lutheran churches in Minnesota. I became a follower of Jesus in October of 1980. And really, there's an aspect of stewardship from the very beginning of my decision to follow Jesus, because where I was in my little farming community in Fergus Falls, Minnesota, we're talking late 70s, discos had come late to my little town, 12,000 people, but we had a disco in town. And I got to this place in October 1980 where I realized I needed to make a decision about which direction in life. And part of my decision was, Lord Jesus, and I didn't understand the word repentance, and I hope that's a word you've talked a bit about, and the great joy that is part of that word. But I didn't know what it meant, but I knew I actually had to demonstrate that somehow. And so I said to God, okay, I'm going to follow after you, Jesus, and to demonstrate that, I'm going to stop swearing. I'm going to stop going to the disco and drinking. But third was, instead of earning money for me the following summer for future university, I said, God, whatever you want to do with that, I'll do for you. So instead of earning money for me. Now, I wouldn't have known anything about the word stewardship, but really that was a stewardship decision. That was a recognition that my time, my talents, my treasures were actually not mine. They were something given as a stewardship, as a kind of trusteeship for me to use for his honor and praise. So fast forward, I ended up going to Japan to teach conversational English for almost a year. And when I came back, I changed majors from being an engineering major because of just getting this sense from God about being full on into ministry, into mission, and wanted to go back overseas someplace. And came back to Minnesota, looked for a Bible college that had a cross-cultural ministries degree, ended up moving to Oregon. That's where Tammy and I met. And Tammy's originally from Oregon. And finished 4 years of Bible college there, went and did an internship in a church in Arizona, then came to East Tennessee, then Southwest Virginia. After 5 years, was it 5 years? 5 years of seminary in East Tennessee.
It was like 25 years of seminary.
Yeah, it felt like forever. And then we came to this side of Virginia to start support raising to go to England. Now there's a little pocket, a window of time in there where coming to graduation from seminary, thinking, okay, what do we do next? I was leading a church full-time. I was a full-time student, and probably some of you know the challenges of being full-time students, having full-time jobs, and trying to navigate that and do your reading and essays and all that sort of thing. And it's a challenging time. And it's actually a stewardship time, isn't it? Because you have to make decisions about what you put your time and energy into. So quite familiar with that. But when it came to thinking about what we do, and going overseas to be a cross-cultural church planter, there was a point in time in May of 1992, before we met the Barnetts and moved this direction, where our original destination was Singapore. That's where we thought we were going. And then Singapore, as a government, put out this government white paper that wanted religious parity in their society. So they actually shut down visas that would make it possible for folks like us to actually go into the country as missionaries. And so it suddenly kind of threw things up in the air, and then we had these, so what are we gonna do? So we thought we were going there. And we had a couple organizations asked us to consider going to the West Coast to church plant, or to be on staff with a church as minister of evangelism. Then the organization that we affiliated with said, would you go to Thailand? And would you go to Ukraine and open up new fields there? And we remember having these conversations, Tammy and I, about what, could this be? Now there's other life stuff going on with our kids that we had, and trying to think that through. And then our mission organization said, would you consider going to England? Now, England was part of Europe, and I'd said years before, I would never go there. And as we're weighing all these things up, really, it was a kind of stewardship thing. Now some people might use the language of call, having sense that God has spoken into them by the Spirit, and they have this strong sense of call. And yes, we had a call to cross-cultural ministry, but the location we didn't know. And again, I wasn't particularly passionate about going to Europe at all. But when we got down to it, we started thinking about the number of people that would stay in America with the kind of giftedness that we had and the kind of experience we had, that more people would stay in America with the opportunities there than actually work overseas cross-culturally. And so there's a very deep sense that it was a stewardship decision. That if God has gifted us this way, if we're aware of how He's resourced us, and then the actual experience of raising support to go to England, because that's another kind of test, a kind of stewardship test, is a test of call, because that is a brutal process, is a bit too strong, but it is certainly a winnowing process, because of having this persevere, having to engage with churches, having to engage with people, saying, would you partner with us for this vision of what God has called us to in England? But at the core of it, for us, it was partly a stewardship decision. What are we going to do with what God has gifted us with? So, as I mentioned earlier, we've been in England 27 years now. We planted a church in a new build area with some colleagues. We experimented with a simple form of church we started. 6 years ago, we moved from kind of leafy suburb area of Birmingham, England, into the inner city. We went from kind of a monocultural area to a place of many cultures and great diversity, into a place that has more of the common kinds of issues of drugs, prostitution, knife crime, and economic deprivation. And it's actually a place we've been now for 6 years that we love. So that gives you a little bit of picture of our point of view and thinking about it from a stewardship perspective. And I'll leave it on to let you guys ask some questions.
What was like the most challenging part of like getting into the culture there, like from like American culture to the British culture? Like what was like the most challenging part for you guys?
You're gonna come up and join me for this now.
Say pretty please.
Pretty please. Tammy is the introvert, I'm the extrovert, but we're a team, and Tammy has a lot more wise things to say than I do. So,
That's not so.
so can you say the question loudly one more time?
What was like the most difficult part for like culture, like going from an American culture to like the European culture? What was most challenging? Like, what did you guys find most challenging about that?
Off the top of my head, I would think for me it was because from a faraway perspective, a lot of people think England is almost identical to the US because you speak a similar, not same, but similar language. And so, and on the surface, a lot of things, although they're unique to American eyes, they're pretty similar to the US. And so I think the cultural perspective of digging deep and then really realizing that you think you're communicating because you're using similar words, but they have different meanings and they have different background, people worldviews from what happened during the world wars and how that devastated Europe more than it devastated the US just because of the proximity to what was going on in the fighting and those kinds of things that have lingered on. And so I think for me, it was thinking I was communicating and going, that was a really unsatisfying conversation because I don't think I understand what they were saying, even though they were speaking English. And so I think from a cultural perspective, that's just off the top of my head, that was really difficult for me.
I think there's a couple of sayings that we've heard that describe a bit of the cultural difference. One is, we're two countries divided by a common language. Another one, again, these aren't original with us, but another one is the difference between England and America is, whereas in America 100 years is a long time, in England 100 miles is a long ways. Now those statements, they begin to describe the cultural differences that aren't surface level. Does that make sense? Yeah. So then there's the effects of globalization. So American TV. So I did a research trip in England in 1993, and I was there I think almost 2 weeks. And during that 2 weeks is when Waco happened. And I kept being asked, so do you live in a place like the TV show Dallas? As if that was reality. Good question.
I have two questions. So I was wondering if you guys have heard of or worked with something like Patel Ministries or something like that?
We've heard of it, yeah.
Okay. My parents had been over a couple times over with them, so I was curious if you guys heard of them. But my other question was like, what is so you guys said you're like church planters and stuff. I was wondering what the process looks like from like somebody you just like met on the street to like fully committed Christian, and like what that process for you looks like, how like involved you are versus like what's your setup for that.
So do we have 5 years for that? That actually is a really good question. Do you want to first go ahead?
No, because my sarcastic comment was going to be very British, which was that one of the things that people say is, how long is a piece of string? It's so, there's no consistent answer to that, because there is a very big distance between the traditional gathered church and the majority of the English population. And so it depends on how close that distance is, how long that process is. That's my first thinking. But we've always found in the time that we've spent in England that you have to start with building relationships. And we have a group that we work with on a regular basis. It's a program that we helped develop. It's called Equip Britain. And we talk to them about the fact that in building relationships, you are very intentional when you're building relationships, and you do have an agenda in your head. They're not a project, but you do have the agenda of helping them understand who Jesus is and becoming a follower. So we talk a lot with our Equip participants about moving people from casual to meaningful to spiritual conversations but not stopping at the spiritual conversation, moving them into discovery Bible studies, discovery Bible groups, with the very intense purpose of churches growing up around those individuals that are being discipled. And so through our years of being in England, we've started talking more about the language of disciple-making movements rather than church planting. Not that church planting is bad, because church planting is very good, but Jesus never commanded in the New Testament for us to plant churches, but he did command for us to make disciples. And so that whole process looks different in different contexts that you're working in, because those churches and those disciples are going to form differently depending upon the context, which is why it's not a cop-out answer to your question. It's just that there's no one way to answer that, except for the fact that you intentionally engage with people, you build relationships, and you move into those spiritual conversations with the intent of developing Bible studies and have those communities form around the individuals that are becoming disciples.
Yeah, so that's really good, Tammy. The couple of different things I think about with your question in mind is, one, culture is always changing. So we're having to continually adjust how we communicate the message in a way that's relevant. So 30 years ago, nobody talked about postmodernity, but I'm guessing as part of your studies through the last couple of years, you've talked about postmodernity, have you not?
I don't know what the term is exactly, but I think so.
Oh, okay. Have you talked about post-Christendom?
I think so, yeah.
Okay. Have you talked about millennials?
Yeah.
Okay. You guys are millennials, except our brother over here in the back,
Yeah.
who looks really, he has a great crown on his head. I mean, these are realities that we have to learn how to engage people with the good news of the gospel, good news of the kingdom of heaven. I'm actually going to speak about discipleship specifically in the chapel time. But one of the things I'd say, maybe just to kind of finish and answer the question, is we've got to take discipleship much more seriously in the church in the Western world than we ever have been, because we're being discipled by someone or something. Culture is discipling us, maybe unintentionally, in some ways intentionally, with kind of cultural forces, influences. And the question is, are we in the church intentionally discipling people into the kind of abundant life that Jesus invited us and called us into and offers? And if we're not doing that, so coming back to the Great Commission, does anybody got it memorized? Matthew 28, 18 to 20? Anybody? Okay, so Jesus says, all authority in heaven and earth has been given to me. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations,
Teaching them.
baptizing in the name of the Father, Son, and Spirit, and, sister, teaching them to
Observe.
Observe all things.
that I've commanded you, or teaching them to obey all things I've commanded you. And then the promise is
I am with you
always, to the very end of time. Yeah, okay. So, if Jesus said that, and it's kind of the crowning words of Matthew's gospel at the very end, maybe we should take that seriously. Well, I'm going to say more about that this morning in chapel.